Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We're going to continue on with the wellness journey for the Neurodiverse video series, and we're going to be talking about the wellness journey now and specific to the neurodiverse. Now, neurodiverse people are those with unique nervous systems that may interact with the world in a slightly different way or may take in information in a slightly different way. So, we're going to why this is so important is that the people that are neurodiverse have unique nervous systems, and in a sense, to run those nervous systems might take different resources, and specifically resources are energy resources. And there's a tendency in this population group to experience increased rates of depression, anxiety, and most importantly, burnout. And so understanding the importance of wellness and, in a sense, self-care is so critical to maintaining a productive and healthy life. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, the wellness journey for the neurodiverse and the specific things that help each and every one of us are going to be very, very specific, and they may be different for the neurotypical person. So the first of all, what we need to do is review health, determinants of health, and we have to make sure that each one of these needs are met, because if they're not met, we're going to experience some challenges with getting to the next level of wellness. So if you think of wellness as being like a stack of rocks, if you can go to the beach and you can stack the rocks. It's a great mindfulness activity to do, and see how high you can stack those rocks. And just like as you work your way from the bottom, you need a nice foundation, and then you keep adding layers upon layers upon layers. Well, at the bottom of our stack, we're going to have these determinants of health, and if they're not there, there's no sense going to the upper layers beforehand. So determinants of health are things like water needs, social needs, living needs, and diet needs. So water needs are going to be just hydration and electrolytes, salt and potassium and minerals. These are all going to be needed for our cells to function. And this is specifically important because all chemical reactions in the body occur in water. And essentially, we're probably more water than we are anything else, which is kind of a weird thing to think about, but we are living water literally. 90% of our cells of our mass is made up of water, right? So it's something that's absolutely needed. And symptoms of dehydration are things like mental fog, confusion, anxiety. So the water needs must be met in everyone, but in the neurodiverse people, we may actually have an increased need of water and an increased need of fluid volume, because there's some specific health challenges that we'll talk about that people that are neurodiverse have because they have unique nervous systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically in the autonomic component. Then we talk about social needs. Now, this is interestingly important because there's some stereotypes that maybe people on the autism spectrum may not need social interactions, and that's generally not true. They just need different social interactions, or what fills their bucket is different social interactions rather than going out to a busy place. Getting social interactions in maybe small groups might be better and more significant and build and make someone feel connected to a community. So the social needs need to be met and evaluated and figure out ways to get those social needs. Sometimes it's just finding other people with a specific interest that you'll connect with that could make a social need. Sometimes it's going to a meetup for a hike in a very small group, or meeting with friends and just family. Sometimes we'll meet those specific social needs in some certain ways. Without that, we're at increased risks of a lot of chronic health problems, actually. Recently, we found that people who are socially isolated have an increased risk of heart disease, and that it is similar to the risk of, say, smoking. So very important to maintain social needs. Then also what we have is living needs. And this means we have a healthy, hygienic place to live and to sleep. There's lots of associations with strong health, and those conditions needed to be met in order to have a basis of health. So whatever that means is unique to the individual, whether that's living in a tiny home or a big home or just living in a tent. That depends on the individual person, but generally there is a basic need for a good living environment. It also means that the living environment is a positive environment and there's no abusive relationships, and also people in that environment that are, accepting of who you are, um, and there's no kind of weird dynamics going on there. Then the next thing is the dietary needs, and these are things like caloric intake. So people may need an increase in calories because, when you are under a higher level of stress because you're taking in more sensory information, it makes more sense that you're going to have more caloric need, and you're going to need more proteins, you're going to need more fats, and specific diets may apply and make you feel better. Like, for example, some people might do better on a low-carb ketogenic diet, whereas other people may be better on a vegan or plant-based diet. So dietary needs can be tailored as well to the individual. So the other area that I find particularly fascinating is autonomic and self-regulation. And this is interesting because what I've found is when I worked with many people, I would run something called heart rate variability. And this is a biomarker that we can use to look at the autonomic process, the autonomic nervous system balance. And this is not the brain, well, entirely the brain, but it's more the peripheral nervous system, the nervous system outside the brain, and it's all it modulates all the automatic processes in the body, the things we don't think about. So that would be things like our sleep, our wake cycle, our adrenaline responses, and our relaxation responses, our digestion, our sweating, our body temperature. These are all regulated by the autonomic nervous system. And interestingly, I've found clinically that people who are neurodiverse often have a neurodiverse autonomic balance, which kind of makes sense. At the beginning, when I first started getting into this, I was very confused about certain nervous systems or people that didn't fit the right reference ranges for what I thought was normal, or they would swing, their autonomic systems would swing to these highs and lows very quickly, and I couldn't really figure it out until I started to learn more about neurodiversity and specifically things like autism, and found, okay, it makes sense to me now, and it makes sense to me. These autonomic nervous system might be a little bit different in people that have different brains, for example, and think differently. And so specifically talking about autonomic, this is your fight and flight system. So we have two sides. The one side is going to be fight or flight. That's the anxiety side, the stimulation side. And then we have the rest and digest side, and that's going to be the calming side and the digesting side. And when you have one is high, the other one's going to be low. So when you're constantly in a fight or flight or chronic stress response, your rest and digest systems are going to be low. And that's, true for anybody, not just the neurodiverse. But seems to be, in my research and findings, we seem to see lots of sliding between the two. And people can kind of get stuck in either a fight or flight response, or they can get stuck in more of a rest and digest response, what we call a vagus, kind of over boost in the vagus nerve. And those mean something, and something kind of interesting. When someone is in, say, what we call sympathetic overload, meaning they're in the fight or flight response mostly all the time, then specifically they may really benefit from relaxation exercises or calming exercises, things that boost the vagus nerve, right? I generally see this in people with, say, autistic burnout or just burnout in general. And that's when the chronic stress response has just been there for a long period of time, and the nervous system kind of just permanently in a sympathetic overload, and it's difficult to shift. out of that to more of the more calming rest and digest. The other side is we see this parasympathetic system, and some people can be stuck in a parasympathetic dominance, meaning that they feel tired, groggy, they feel just foggy in the head because their parasympathetic systems may be too high. What we really need, a well-balanced nervous system, is kind of in the middle, right? We need a little bit of sympathetic stimulation, a little bit of parasympathetic relaxation, and together we get this nice balanced nervous system. So when we're on either sides, and we shift easily from either side, or it's hard to control from either side of those of that continuum, we can run into problems. But interestingly, I found through my own research and just trial and error, trying these out with clinic people in my office, was when I find people are in a sympathetic, again, to do breathing exercises to bring up their parasympathetic, their nervous system, and when they're in the other side, I get them to do stimulation exercises. So these are things like going for a jog or jumping around or listening to music. This is very stimulating, so we call that stimming, and that's very important in the neurodiverse population, is to regulate the nervous system through some forms of self-stimulation. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is and as we continue on later in our talk. But it is very interesting, and what I found to learn, and what I feel what is happening with these autonomic imbalances, is that people who might be neurodiverse might be more influenced by the environment and their surroundings on how they self-regulate. So for example, if they're in really busy, overstimulating environments, they may self-regulate. The nervous system may mimic those environments, right? And they may go into more of a chaotic state. Whereas if they're in the more calming, relaxing area or something, they might go into the parasympathetic dominance really easily, and they have difficulty shifting in between automatically, right? It's more externally driven or more body driven, and that's an important little bit of observation to think about. If you are more externally driven, you might take on emotions from other people, you might misread certain situations socially, or when you get home you might sit down and your nervous system might just dominate into a parasympathetic overload, and you may get really tired and groggy when you're not moving around, right? And these kind of people, when they're in parasympathetic dominance, always move around to keep themselves awake. So understanding that is quite an interesting thing, and gets you to understand how to have a balance between the two to keep yourself productive and keep your nervous systems happy. Then we have something that we call sensory needs, and it's important to have specific sensory needs. We all have sensory needs and sensory sensitivities, so it's important to be aware of that when you are navigating the world, and understanding that there's specific sensory needs are any type of senses can get overloaded, and so for example, you might get overloaded with light, or we might get overloaded with sounds, smells, and textures, and touch sensations, or pain, or temperature. So all these senses, whatever is coming into our body, it could overwhelm a very sensitive nervous system, and those that are neurodiverse tend to, again, they take in a lot of extra sensory information from the environment, and that might regulate you, right? So chaotic environments may create chaotic brain waves and chaotic internal environments, or being around people that are more stressed out might, again, feed back into the system and overload you. So understanding that, again, is important, because you can make very important work adaptations, family adaptations, social adaptations, in order to make sure you're thriving, and just understanding you have sensory needs, and also understanding what happens when the sensory needs kind of overload and cause you to go into maybe a meltdown or a shutdown, or have too much anxiety, and how to counteract those. Specifically, I've found that when you have a specific sensory need, when you become aware of the sensory needs, it's generally the one that you're sensitive to. The antidote is generally how do I really explain this? So for example, if you have a sensory sensitivity of loud and chaotic environments, that's my sensitivity. I cannot listen to other people or carry on a conversation or really understand. Those are very anxiety provoking environments. And specifically, the antidote to that is actually loud music and rhythmic music. So things that really touch me to a deep level, the music, it does the opposite. So it makes me calm, regulated, and relaxed. So that's very interesting that it's the same sensory input, but just a different form of the sensory input is usually the antidote. So chaotic sounds are the deregulating, and relaxing sounds are the regulating, for example. And touch, so same with that. Light touch may be very irritating, but deep, heavy touch might be very calming and relaxing. And the same with light. Light brights might be, again, stimulating, and then certain colors of lights or certain patterns of lights, certain might be very relaxing, or actually dimming the lights may be very relaxing. So that's one way to kind of check in on your sensory needs and understand if you have some sensory sensitivities, that you can work with those and figure those out. And that's a very important part of the wellness journey for the neurodiverse. The next thing is just understanding your nervous system has a very unique need and needs some certain things that maybe the average person doesn't need as much of. So stimming and stimulation, self-stimulation, is something that we talk more and more about. We're hearing more and more about schools and allowing people to use those fidget spinners. And so we all have it to a certain extent. It's something that relieves anxiety. It's something that when we're agitated, it calms us down. So stimming is things like shaking your leg or bouncing your leg when you're sitting and you're nervous before a test, or humming or singing or talking to yourself, or just walking in circles. These are all self-stimulatory mechanisms that we use to regulate ourselves, and everybody does it, but they generally only do it, the neurotypical population generally only does it during times of stress, right? And at random points, but the neurodiverse population might need stimulation or self-stimulation all the time, and they may have a very strong desire or thirst for it. So stimulation can be in the forms of jumping up and down, running around, walking in circles, walking around the block. That can manifest in many different ways, and actually many people will stim and they don't even know it, in funny and peculiar ways. So and if you force yourself to stop stimming in your neurodiverse, it often shows up in weird and peculiar ways, especially in adults. And kids, they kind of don't inhibit their stimming as much, but in adults, we learn to inhibit our stimming, and will result in funny, unusual behaviors, or even funny, unusual symptoms. And the most common symptom, I would say, that I've read and something I experience is an overwhelming sense of anxiety, overload, overwhelm, foggy brain, and also just stress and anxiety. So that is stimming, and they absolutely needs it. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, the funny symptom that I have when I learned to stop stimming, kind of learned to stop self-regulating through these mechanisms, I developed a chronic cough. So during times of the year where I was more sedentary and I did less stimming, I developed a cough, and I developed a chronic cough. And we could not figure out the cause of that cough for many, many years, until we learned that I was doing something, that I was stimming. And we learned it through my daughter, who also has these sensory needs as well, and had the exact same symptoms come on, and we're going, why are we both the same here? We don't have the same cough for the same reason. It was because it was a form of self-stimulation. The body will stimulate itself in some way if you start to inhibit itself. So a simple antidote to that is just simply moving or allowing yourself to have the sensory needs. Okay, so the other thing we have to be aware about in terms of neurodiverse in the wellness journey is meltdowns. So there's two things, meltdowns and shutdowns. Both are very similar events. A meltdown is an external manifestation of overwhelm. It's a neurological event that you cannot control. Once it's got to a certain threshold, meltdowns happen. in the neurodiverse population, whereas meltdowns happen in the regular population, but they are controllable. There's something that they can regulate, and a meltdown in the neurotypical population can be easily diffused, and whereas in the neurodiverse population, it comes across as being very out of control, overwhelmed, and it just doesn't make sense for the person, because generally these people are well behaved in most settings, and they can take a lot, and then all of a sudden the stressors add up slowly until they can't take it, and then they have a meltdown. External manifestation, sometimes it's yelling, sometimes it's kicking or throwing things. It can be a variety of things. So understanding that this is something that happens, and as long as it's not hurting anybody else, then we shouldn't feel bad about it. It's something that happens. We can learn strategies to reduce the triggers, find the triggers, reduce the triggers of overwhelm, like sensory overload, increase emotional stress, and take preparations for it to happen if you feel the symptoms of it coming. The opposite side, the internal manifestation, I like to think of it as an internal manifestation of a meltdown, is rather than going external, you can go internal. And this can be very confusing. This is something that is often, people kind of can have a dominance in external manifestations of meltdowns or dominant in shutdowns. I specifically have more of the shutdowns rather than meltdowns, and those are things that I just disappear from the world. I cannot hear, I cannot often, there's all different degrees of shutdowns. When they're really extreme, I just disappear, I dissociate almost. Otherwise, if it's just like the beginning signs of a shutdown, I will have a foggy thinking. I may start frowning my eyes around the eyes because I'm trying to work harder to think. I will just won't be able to really engage in a conversation. I might stop talking and just carry out interactions like I know what's going on, but I can't follow the conversation that's going on. So basically, you can't think, you can't talk, you can't push through it. And that's the thing that, again, that is different for the neurodiverse population other than the neurotypical population, is that people can't push through it. And neurodiverse people can't push through it. They have to let their nervous system shut down because they're taking in more information. It would be kind of absurd to think that a computer, if you have all these tabs open on a computer or computer program going, too many computer programs going, and the computer is overloading and overheating, that you just keep going, right? You just push through it. That does not happen with computers, and that also does not happen with our neurodiverse brains. We need to stop, shut down, and let it restart. Sometimes it may take 10 minutes. Sometimes it may take an hour. People go in, when they allow their bodies to shut down, the nervous system, it's usually a good experience. The nervous system begins to kind of restart. And it may have waves of kind of energy flowing, and it just may have a nice calming effect through the shutdown. And then all of a sudden, but everybody almost experiences a sense of fatigue. They can't really communicate. They might be hyper irritable to sounds and touch. And when they let their bodies to shut down, all of a sudden things reboot, and you have almost like this intense second wind of energy and almost, lower anxiety, and you have this new threshold. And again, you may continue on with your day and have another shutdown. For example, I have sensory shutdowns, and I can have up to 6 in a day, and they can be at random times. They can be very unpredictable, but the better I get at finding those triggers, the better I get at managing them. And the big thing is to just let the body shut down. The other thing is just really understanding what a shutdown is versus, say, anxiety, and knowing that they are slightly different mechanisms, and a shutdown is something you can kind of let yourself kind of shut down, whereas anxiety might be a different approach. Maybe we need to push through that a little bit, but that's all for another talk. Okay, so that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to take a little break. What we talked about in this video was just learning about the neurodiverse nervous system and the specific nervous system needs that we need in order to thrive. And we learned about our determinants of health and how those may be different. The next thing we're going to be talking about in the next module, the next little video, is just how we can treat and how we can, modulate our nervous system from more of a functional perspective and support ourselves a little bit more effectively. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video.